Dr. Jacqui Dillon is an activist, writer and educator, and has lectured and published internationally on alternatives to psychiatric diagnoses. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Jacqui, and she's got some slides for us as well. Again, just to encourage you, any questions, anything that's been prompted by what Lucy said or gets prompted by what Jacqui tells us, put questions in the chat and we'll look forward to having 10, 12 minutes subsequently to discuss those. Okay, over to Jacqui.
Lovely, that's great, thank you. Perfect to follow on from Lucy. This will hopefully segue nicely for people. So I'm aware that that's a lot to unpack from Lucy. She's presented a lot of information which may arouse lots of different feelings for people, and we will have a moment at the end of the slides I'm going to show to take a few questions. I'd really recommend her book though. As she said, the second edition is out today, and it's a really excellent summary, very, very accessible way of thinking about the dominant way that we currently think about mental health problems and distress, which Lucy and I and many, many other people think isn't necessarily that helpful. So one of the things I want to just touch on briefly is like, well, what happens if we do move beyond this sort of biomedical way of thinking about problems, which sort of firmly locates problems purely in people's brains, or mainly in people's brains, rather than seeing that people's distress and the many ways that it manifests in people's lives is understandable and meaningful. So the first thing that I wanted to do was just briefly flag up this concept. So the Structure of Scientific Revolutions is a really important book by philosopher Thomas Kuhn, who popularized this term paradigms. And one of the things that he really argued was the way in which knowledge evolves and changes. It's really crucial to think about how that happens in science, and how we move from a kind of one way of thinking about things, which is considered the orthodoxy, how that then shifts. And he proposed this way of thinking about things, which is that first there's this kind of period of crisis in which the paradigms, the framework, the models that we have fail to adequately answer questions considered fundamental. So serious anomalies occur in which phenomena are not clearly compatible with the paradigm are observed. So as Lucy said, lots and lots of questions about the adequacy of a biomedical model, and a lot of what is touted are hypotheses that are not proven. Yet they're spoken of as fact, and that actually a lot of the facts about the adversity in people's lives is often ignored for quite complicated but really important reasons. And really the third part of this process that Kuhn described in his really important work was that a suitable alternative paradigm emerges that explains many of the previous findings. That's a bit of a wordy way of saying that the old ways of thinking about things have served a purpose, and Lucy and I and a lot of other people would argue that they've actually outlived their usefulness, and that there are other ways of thinking about what's happening for people and other ways of responding. And of course, Peertalk and initiatives like it are really, really important. People getting together, supporting each other, communities are a resource. And it's really important that we recognise that we all have expertise and knowledge as human beings about how to support each other outside of and alongside of professional knowledge. So suitable alternative paradigms exist, and because I haven't got very long, I've just sort of put together a few ideas about what's out there currently, some of which you will have heard of, some of it you may not have. The first is the spiritual crisis approach. The other is the hearing voices approach, an organisation that I've been involved with for a really long time. The open dialogue approach, trauma-informed approaches, which are currently making a lot of headway. So you're probably hearing quite a lot of that if you're in and around health and mental health services. And finally, Lucy, at the end of her talk, mentioned the power, threat, meaning framework. So I'm going to talk about that briefly too. So the first is the Spiritual Crisis Network. So Spiritual Crisis Networks believes that psychological and mental health difficulties can actually be deeply transformative, offering the possibility of breakthrough rather than breakdown. So they've got a completely different framework and a completely different way of both understanding and responding to distress. So they would see crisis as actually a spiritual emergency, where a process of spiritual emergence or awakening becomes unmanageable for the individual. Just to say, Spiritual Crisis Network, I'm not involved, but I do know people that are. They don't advocate one particular religious or spiritual belief. They're open to all belief systems. So they understand spiritual crisis as a turbulent period of spiritual opening or transformation. And actually that rather than, that it be a breakdown, it's a potential breakthrough for people. So they see themselves as both an alternative or as complementary to approaches to psychological difficulties, including but not exclusively psychosis. And although spirituality has long been the preserver of transpersonal psychology, so things like psychosynthesis and things like that, there are a number of forward-thinking psychiatrists and other healthcare professionals that are really advocating for the importance of acknowledging the spiritual as being crucial in thinking about mental health crisis, but also what might be healing in terms of people recovering from crisis. So this approach parallels, is allied to other innovative approaches, things like peer-supported open dialogue and hearing voices network. So another approach is the Hearing Voices movement. So it's pioneered by a Dutch psychiatrist and his partner who worked with the voice hearer. And in a nutshell, what the Hearing Voices approach is saying is something quite contrary to traditional psychiatry, which very much locates voice hearing as a product of brain and cognitive fault. So very sort of mechanistic, very much looking at sort of problems in people's brains. And really what the whole Hearing Voices approach is saying, actually, contrary to a medical approach, which is saying ignore the voices, take medication, they're just symptoms of an illness, got too much dopamine in your brain. What the Hearing Voices approach is saying is that voices actually make a lot of sense. And they particularly make sense when you look at the context in which the voices emerged. So the Hearing Voices movement is very interested in the operation of power. So it contests this sort of very traditional relationship of the sort of dominant expert clinician and the passive recipient patient. And it much more is about kind of mutually respectful relationships, so developing authentic partnerships between experts by experience and experts by profession. So the Hearing Voices approach very much sees voice hearing as significant and meaningful. And there's this really strong link with traumatic life events. Big piece of research that Ron Manesha did back in the 80s found this very strong link with trauma. About 77% of people linked voice hearing with trauma. And in fact, other research that has been carried out subsequently, which is actually asking much more specific questions about voice hearing and trauma, puts that figure in the 90s. So again, underlining that it's not about what's wrong with you, it's about what's happened to you. Another approach which many of you will have heard about is the open dialogue approach. It was first pioneered in Western Lapland in Finland. And it's not really an alternative to diagnosis, but it's certainly a challenge to the sort of psychiatric orthodoxy, and it certainly questioned the operation of power. And you don't need to have a diagnosis to work within an open dialogue framework. So in 1980s in Western Lapland, services were really in a bad state. So they kind of innovated this new approach, open dialogue. And essentially what it is is two clinicians get together with the person and their network and have an open conversation, and a series of open conversations that may go on for a couple of years. I mean, and one of the things that's really, really exciting for me is that this stuff's now being pioneered in the UK, and peer workers are kind of being involved in the heart of this work. So they're kind of being involved as a clinician would be. And the open dialogue approach, in terms of things like what we currently describe as psychosis, they've got the best outcomes in the Western world. And some people kind of joke that actually their outcomes are so marvelous that potentially everyone, whether you've got distress or not, should get the opportunity to do some open dialogue work, because people who do open dialogue have got greater rates of employment than people in the general population. So it's really, really exciting and lots of potential. As Lucy said, mentioned trauma-informed approaches. And really the trauma-informed approach, this is where this notion of it's not what's happened to you, it's not what's wrong with you, it's what's happened to you, that's where it really emerged from, this trauma-informed approach. So really the trauma-informed approach is very much privileging people's experiences. It's saying very much that people with lived experience of distress needs to be in charge of their own healing, that they need to be the authors and arbiters of their own recovery. So very much back to this idea of people need to be able to write their own accounts and their own narratives and not have them dictated to by professionals. So recovery is very much based on the empowerment of the survivor. And it's about relationships as well. You know, the trauma-informed approach is very much predicated on having meaningful relationships. So, and at its essence, what a trauma-informed approach is saying is that we're not dealing with people with problems, we're dealing with patients with illnesses, and so-called symptoms, which of course is a very medical term, are better understood as survival mechanisms, essential in the face of overwhelming events and circumstances, but they may have outlived their usefulness. And one of the sort of benefits of being able to look at coping strategies is to think, well, maybe that helped when I was a teenager, but now, you know, that I'm an adult, I might actually want to think about, are there other ways? So avoiding conflict might have been something that I needed to do, for example, as a teenager, but if I'm still employing that as a strategy, it might leave me open to kind of not getting my needs met. And maybe my circumstances have changed now and I'm able to be kind of more assertive, for example. So we've already spoken about this. So again, at its heart, what a trauma-informed approach is saying is that madness and distress make sense, that people aren't just, you know, kind of victims of faulty brain chemistry and wiring, that our brains and our minds develop in environments that sometimes are traumatizing and cause us distress. So instead of diagnosing people, we need to listen to their stories. And briefly want to touch upon this, the power threat meaning framework. As Lucy said, it's a really ambitious project that was put together by a group of psychologists and survivors, myself included. And we had a large group of people that consulted us. It took us a long time to come up with this framework, and it's a working model. We're certainly not saying this is it. We wouldn't be that arrogant. All of the document and associated documents are available, which John will share in the chat. So really it's an attempt to outline an alternative to the diagnostic model of distress and unusual experiences. And it was funded by the Division of Clinical Psychology, which is a branch of the British Psychological Society. And it's it's essentially a framework that understands people in their relational, social and political environments and sees people as acting and making meanings within their life circumstances. The people make sense and their distress makes sense, but what's crucial is context. And it's one of the things that unfortunately is often missing in psychiatric settings. And crucially, we're not proposing this just for people that are subject to psychiatric diagnosis. What we're saying is that this is something that could be useful for all of us in terms of thinking about ourselves and our lives. So along with fulfilling more effectively the general functions of diagnosis in terms of, you know, trying to kind of think about, well, what patterns of distress emerge, you know, if people are subject to certain adversities. Like one of the things we know, for example, from the literature that is that people who may have unusual beliefs, which are typically called delusions in psychiatry, may have been subject to a lot of social exclusion and things like bullying. So tons of research now looking at the links between these sort of causal factors, social factors, and the development of certain sets of problems. So that's one of the functions of the power threat meaning framework, to see if there are certain patterns that seem to emerge out of certain difficulties. But as well as that, you know, recognizing that emotional distress and troubled or troubling behavior are all understandable responses to a person's history and circumstances. You know, it restores this crucial link between distress and social injustice. Why is it that in areas of greater social deprivation, there's much more incidence of things like psychiatric diagnoses and prescription rates, for example? It increases people's access to power and resources. So all of the approaches that I've just mentioned and many, many more are incorporated under that framework. So it's not pretending to be the answer. It's saying there's a whole load of different ways, but this is a framework that would be useful potentially in thinking about people's distress. And it's something we're offering, of course. It's not something we would want to impose. So it's about creating validating narratives which inform and empower people, groups and communities by restoring these links and meanings. And ultimately, one of the things that we think could come out of it is actually about promoting social action. So rather than just, you know, lots of people in one area being, you know, defined as mentally ill, potentially what could come out of it is they all get together and actually, you know, start demanding better housing conditions for themselves, for example. So that's a really quick whistle-stop tour of some alternatives. I hope that was useful for people. I think John may have shared this in the chat. Power threat meaning framework is available in a number of languages, and it's attracting interest across the world because it's really a fabulous and different and new way of people thinking about what's going on for all of us. And that's linked to me and my work. Thanks, everyone.